a millionaire abandoned his illegitimate child in a junkyard. Years later, the millionaire was shocked when a poor young man who looked exactly like him saved his life. The air in the hospital room was thick, the faint scent of antiseptic mingling with the sterile chill of machines humming softly in the background. Dim fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting pale shadows on Diana's sunken face. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her chest rising and falling with a fragile rhythm. In her trembling arms, a newborn wailed softly, its tiny fists clenching against the thin hospital blanket. "Christian," Diana whispered, her voice so faint it seemed to dissolve into the air. Her lips quivered, and her gaze, though glassy, locked onto his. She clung to that moment, desperate to make him listen. Her hand, frail but determined, reached out toward him, a silver necklace dangling from her fingers. Christian hesitated. He stood stiffly at the foot of her bed, his suit creased, his tie loosened just enough to betray his usual composure. He jammed his hands into his coat pockets, pressing his fingers hard against the seams, as if to keep himself anchored. "Take it," she rasped, her eyes flicking to the baby and back to Christian. "Promise me. Promise you'll protect him." The necklace caught the faint light, a delicate chain, the pendant worn and smooth from years of touch. It swayed in her grip, the only movement, in a room otherwise frozen by unspoken tension. Christian stepped closer, the sound of his shoes muffled by the tiled floor. He took the necklace gingerly, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. It was cold, lifeless, like the air between them. Her hand fell to the bed as if the act had drained her last reserves of strength. The machines beside her stuttered, a low warning beep breaking the silence. The baby let out a cry, high and insistent, as if it understood the world it had just entered was unraveling before it. Christian stared at the child, his chest tight with an ache he couldn't name. His gaze darted to Diana, the woman for whom he had a misguided affection. Her face slack now, her head lolled to one side. The slow, steady wail of the monitor filled the room, drowning out the child's cries and Christian's thoughts. He staggered back a step, the necklace clutched tightly in his palm, its edges biting into his skin. The rain slashed against the windshield, turning the city's neon glow into smears of color. The rhythmic thud of the wipers was the only sound in the car apart from the soft, intermittent whimpers from the bundle in the back seat. Christian gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his mind spinning in tight circles of guilt and panic. "Think," he muttered, his voice low and strained. His breath fogged the glass, and he leaned forward, squinting through the storm. The orphanage was only a few miles ahead. It was the best he could do, at least until he had time to figure things out. A sharp vibration rattled the dashboard. Christian glanced at his phone, the screen glowing with Catherine, his soon-to-be wife's name. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before snatching it up. "What?" he barked, his frustration spilling into the single syllable. On the other end, Catherine's voice was taut with accusation. "Do you have any idea what people are saying, Christian? There's talk about you and some woman. My father's furious. You need to come home, now." Christian's jaw tightened, his grip on the wheel slackening just slightly. "I'll handle it." "Handle it?" Her voice was sharp, biting. "If you don't fix this immediately, there won't be anything left to handle. Come home, Christian." The call ended abruptly, leaving only the static hum of the radio and the baby's faint whimpering. Christian exhaled shakily, lowering the phone to his lap. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the child's tiny face. The child's face, flushed and wrinkled, resembled a miniature version of Diana. He swallowed hard, his throat constricting. "I'll come back," he whispered, the words sounding hollow even to him. He turned sharply off the road, pulling into the shadowy expanse of a scrapyard. The rain softened, muffled by the layers of rusted cars stacked in jagged silhouettes. He parked near an old sedan, its windows fogged and smeared with dirt. Christian sat there for a moment, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a stone. Then, without allowing himself to think too much, he stepped out into the rain, scooped up the bundle from the back seat, and placed it gently on the cracked leather of the sedan's back seat. The necklace, still warm from his grip, glinted faintly as he draped it over the baby's chest. "I'll come back," he repeated, his voice firmer this time, though his eyes refused to linger on the child. He turned away, his footsteps splashing through shallow puddles as he hurried back to his car. The engine roared to life, and he sped off into the night, the rain erasing his presence as if he had never been there. The child let out a soft cry, barely audible over the storm, in the silence that followed. The night was bitter, the kind of cold that cut through the skin and clung to the bones. Megan pulled her coat tighter around her thin frame, the fabric worn and fraying at the edges. Her boots crunched against the gravel of the scrapyard, the sound faint under the relentless patter of rain. Around her, hulking shadows of rusted cars loomed like forgotten sentinels, their windows smeared with grime and streaked with water. Her breath clouded in the air as she bent to inspect a pile of metal shards, her calloused fingers brushing away the debris. There was only a cracked hubcap and some loose wiring, but it was enough. She straightened with a sigh, her joints aching from the cold. It was then she heard it. The sound was faint and fragile, barely audible over the rain. At first, she thought it was the wind, twisting through the hollow shells of the cars. But no, there it was again. A cry. The cry was small, soft, and unmistakably human. Megan froze, her heart lurching in her chest. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the maze of vehicles. "Hello?" she called, her voice rough from years of shouting over machines and exhaust fumes. It echoed, swallowed by the rain and the oppressive silence of the scrapyard. The cry came again, this time louder, more urgent. Megan's stomach twisted. She stepped forward, her boots slipping slightly on the slick ground, and followed the sound, weaving between the stacked cars. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, an instinctive pull she didn't yet understand. She found the car tucked near the back of the yard, an old sedan with its windows fogged and cracked. The cry was coming from inside. Megan leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass, and wiped at the grime with her sleeve. Her heart clenched. There, swaddled in a thin, damp blanket on the back seat, was a baby. The baby's face contorted in distress, its tiny fists flailing weakly. A silver chain rested against its chest, glinting faintly in the dim light filtering through the rain. Megan glanced around, her eyes darting to the empty expanse of the scrapyard. "Is someone here?" she called again, louder this time. No response. The only sounds were the rain and the baby's feeble cries. She tried the car door. It groaned in protest as it swung open, the hinges stiff with rust. The baby's cries became louder and more piercing, as if it sensed the presence of another person. Megan hesitated, her hands hovering over the small form. "What kind of person?" she muttered under her breath, her voice trailing off. She didn't finish the thought. She couldn't. Her eyes burned, though the rain on her face masked any tears. Carefully, she lifted the baby from the seat. It was lighter than she expected, its tiny body trembling against her chest. The blanket was damp and offered little warmth. Megan adjusted her coat, wrapping it around the child, her movements slow and deliberate. She stood there for a moment, cradling the baby, her gaze fixed on the silver necklace. It was simple, but well made, the kind of thing someone cherished. Megan's fingers brushed it lightly before she shook her head and looked around once more. There was no sign of anyone. There were no hurried footsteps or distant voices calling for a missing child. There was only the sound of rain and the decaying remains of abandoned cars. Megan pressed her lips together, her jaw tightening. "All right," she murmured, her voice softer now, almost resigned. She pulled the baby closer, shielding it as best she could from the rain. Her small apartment was only a few blocks away, tucked above the garage where she worked during the day. It wasn't much. One room, a leaky roof, and a heater that worked half the time. But it was warm, and it was dry. As she walked, the baby's cries softened, replaced by faint whimpers. Megan adjusted her grip, her hands cradling the small body with a tenderness she didn't know she possessed. Despite the deserted streets and relentless rain, Megan moved with purpose, her steps steady, despite the weight of her discovery. When she finally reached her apartment, she pushed open the door with her shoulder, the hinges creaking loudly. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a single bulb. Megan set the baby down gently on the small cot she used for storage, her hands fumbling to find a dry towel. "Let's get you warm," she muttered, her voice rough but not unkind. She worked quickly, drying the baby and wrapping it in an old sweater. The child's breathing slowed, its cries fading into soft, rhythmic hiccups. Megan sat back, her knees protesting as she knelt by the cot. The baby remained motionless, its tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Megan's gaze lingered on the necklace once more. She was unsure of the child's origins or the reason for its abandonment, yet she was certain of one thing. "No one's leaving you behind again," she said softly, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. And in that moment, surrounded by the faint hum of the rain outside, Megan made her choice. A chandelier illuminated the grand dining hall of the Wright estate, casting harsh, sterile light on the faces of Catherine's family. Christian stood in the center, shoulders stiff, his suit damp from the rain outside. Across the room, Catherine's father, a formidable man with a presence as heavy as his wealth, leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Explain yourself," the older man demanded, his voice low but brimming with authority. Christian's jaw tightened. "There's nothing to explain," he replied, each word carefully measured. "It's a baseless rumor. Someone is attempting to instigate conflict." Catherine, seated beside her father, crossed her arms. Her sharp, calculated gaze pinned Christian in place. "Baseless? It's all over the papers. Whispers about some housemaid." Her words sliced through the room like ice. "I've handled it," Christian said, though his clenched fists betrayed his composure. He felt the weight of Diana's necklace in his pocket, a reminder that he was lying to everyone in the room. "Handled it?" Catherine's father leaned back, his tone laced with skepticism. "For your sake, I hope so. This family doesn't tolerate scandal, Christian. Remember who gave you your start." The words lingered like a threat. Christian nodded once, stiffly, and after a moment, the family returned to their dinner, leaving him standing alone with his thoughts. He excused himself, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls as he left the estate. The rain had lessened to a fine drizzle by the time Christian's car screeched to a stop outside the scrapyard. He barely noticed the wet gravel beneath his feet as he sprinted toward the spot where he'd left the child. His coat flapped in the wind, his breaths coming in sharp, ragged bursts. The old sedan was still there, just as he'd left it, but the back seat was empty. "No," Christian muttered, his voice tight with disbelief. He flung the door open, his eyes darting over the seats, searching for any sign of the baby. The blanket had vanished. The car's interior was cold and lifeless. "Where?" he shouted, his voice echoing into the vast, empty scrapyard. Rain trickled down his face, mingling with the sweat on his brow. He spun in place, scanning the shadows of the rusted vehicles, hoping for movement, a sound, anything. "Where are you?" The desperation in his voice cracked through the stillness. He moved between the rows of stacked cars, his shoes slipping on the wet ground. Each step felt heavier than the last, his chest tightening with a mix of panic and guilt. He called out again and again, his voice growing hoarse, but the only response was the steady rhythm of the rain. Finally, he stopped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He leaned against a rusted truck, his head dropping into his hands. Rain dripped from his hair, pooling at his feet, but he barely noticed. He had left his son, alone. Years passed, but the memory of that night clung to Christian like a shadow, ever present and inescapable. He threw himself into his work, each deal and acquisition a distraction from the weight of his guilt. The Wright Corporation grew under his relentless drive, its headquarters becoming a symbol of power and success. Newspapers hailed him as a visionary, a self-made individual who transformed his modest inheritance into an empire. However, when the doors were closed, the veneer began to crack. On the rare nights Christian allowed himself to be alone, his thoughts always drifted back to the scrapyard, to Lucas. The tiny silver necklace now lay hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk. He would sit there, staring at it, the faint hum of the city outside, muffled by the thick glass of his penthouse windows. His fingers would trace the delicate chain, his mind conjuring images of a boy he couldn't remember clearly. A boy who might not even be alive. He told himself that he had done it to protect Lucas, to shield him from a life of scandal and scrutiny. But the excuses rang hollow, their edges dulled by time. He hadn't protected his son. He'd abandoned him. The world around Christian grew louder, shareholder meetings, gala events, the constant clamor of people vying for his attention. But he moved through it all, like a ghost. His interactions became rehearsed, his smile practiced, his words calculated. Even Catherine, ever poised and composed, began to notice the cracks. "You work too much," she would say, her voice carrying a hint of irritation. Christian would only nod, offering vague reassurances that he would take a break soon. But he never did. At night, when the city lights bled into the darkness, Christian would sit in his office, the silver necklace resting in his palm. He would close his eyes and imagine a different life, one where he had kept Lucas, where he had been brave enough to defy Catherine, her family, and the expectations that had bound him. The image never stayed long. Reality would intrude, harsh and unforgiving, leaving him with nothing but the cold weight of the necklace and the hollow ache in his chest. Christian finally realized one night that no amount of success or empire could change his choice. And no matter how far he climbed, the weight of that night would always pull him back down. Despite everything, he continued to advance, with each stride aimed at surpassing the past. However, he knew in his heart that some things were irreversible. The small apartment above the garage smelled of oil and detergent, with faint traces of Megan's homemade stew lingering in the air. The room was dim, lit by a single bulb that flickered whenever the wind rattled the windows. In the corner, a toddler played with a makeshift toy, a worn-out tire iron wrapped in cloth. He giggled, clapping his hands as it spun awkwardly across the floor. Megan, sitting at the rickety table with a pile of mended shirts, glanced over her shoulder and smiled. "Careful, sweetie," she called. "You'll cry for hours if that thing falls on your toes." The boy didn't seem to hear her, his laughter filling the small space. Megan shook her head with an amused sigh. "Stubborn like your mama," she murmured, her hands deftly stitching a patch onto the shirt. Years passed in that cramped, leaky room. It wasn't much, but it was home. Megan worked long hours at the garage below, scrubbing oil stains from the concrete and fixing what she could with her limited tools. Yet, no matter how worn out she was, she always had time for the boy she had found in the scrapyard that rainy night. She called him Lucas. Lucas grew quickly, his energy boundless, despite their humble circumstances. By the time he was 6, he was already helping Megan in small ways, fetching tools, sweeping the garage floor, or carrying water from the communal tap down the street. "Why do we have to work so much?" he asked one day, wiping his brow after hauling a bucket of water up the stairs. His voice was curious, not resentful, as he set the bucket down with a grunt. Megan chuckled, patting his head. "Because, mijo, life doesn't give you anything for free. But that's not a negative thing. It teaches us to be strong, to be grateful for what we have." Lucas nodded solemnly, as if the weight of her words had landed somewhere deep within him. Megan's lessons were practical, born of necessity, but always tinged with affection. She taught Lucas how to sew a button, fix a broken hinge, and even make soup from the smallest scraps of vegetables. More importantly, she taught him kindness, how to share when there wasn't much, smile at strangers, and stand tall no matter the burden. "Kindness doesn't cost you anything," she would say, pressing his hand to her heart, "but it can make someone feel rich." Lucas absorbed her teachings, his young heart shaped by her unwavering determination and love. He rarely thought about the life he might have had, or the parents he never knew. Megan was enough. One rainy afternoon, when Lucas was about 10, he stumbled across an old wooden box tucked beneath Megan's bed. The latch was loose, and the box creaked open easily under his curious fingers. Inside, nestled among folded papers and a few keepsakes, was a delicate silver necklace. The chain glimmered faintly even in the dim light, the pendant smooth and simple. "What's this?" Lucas held up the object as Megan entered the room. Megan froze for a moment, her hand tightening on the doorknob. Her gaze softened as she set down the groceries she'd been carrying. "That," she said, her voice quieter than usual, "belonged to your parents." Lucas tilted his head. "My parents?" Megan nodded, sitting beside him on the bed. She reached out, her calloused fingers brushing the necklace as if it carried the weight of memory. "I found you with this," she said, "that night in the scrapyard. She wrapped it around you, ensuring you wouldn't forget her." Lucas's brow furrowed as he turned the necklace over in his hands. "What were they like?" Megan hesitated, her eyes flickering with emotions she rarely let surface. "I don't know, sweetie. I never met her, but I think they must have loved you very much to leave this behind." "Why didn't they stay?" he asked, his voice small. Megan sighed, pulling him close. "Sometimes people have to make choices we don't understand. Maybe they thought it was the only way to keep you safe." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, the necklace dangling from his fingers. Finally, he looked up at Megan. "But you stayed," he said simply. Her throat tightened, and she nodded, unable to speak. She kissed the top of his head, holding him close as the rain pattered against the windows. From that day on, Lucas wore the necklace tucked beneath his shirt. He didn't ask Megan more about his birth parents. He sensed it was a door she couldn't open. But the necklace became a part of him, a reminder of a past he didn't fully understand, but carried with him nonetheless. Through the years, Megan's lessons and love shaped Lucas into a resourceful and compassionate young man. Though their life was hard, he grew up knowing the value of work, the strength of kindness, and the unbreakable bond of chosen family. While the necklace held a special place in his heart, the questions it posed would persist, awaiting a moment when they could no longer be disregarded. Almost 2 more decades have passed. The Wright Corporation's boardroom buzzed with subdued tension. Christian Wright sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his presence commanding, even as fatigue shadowed his sharp features. Around him, executives shuffled papers and exchanged guarded glances, waiting for their CEO to speak. Christian opened the quarterly earnings report and saw the numbers flash before his eyes. His temples throbbed, the fluorescent lights above feeling brighter, harsher than usual. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, and he gripped the table's edge, willing himself to focus. "Christian," one of the board members ventured, "should we proceed with the—" Christian raised a hand to silence him, but his fingers trembled, betraying his usual composure. Before he could respond, a wave of dizziness swept over him. The room tilted, voices merging into a dull roar. "Mr. Wright?" The last thing Christian saw was the blur of his assistant lunging toward him before the floor rushed up to meet him. The sterile smell of antiseptic was the first thing Christian noticed as consciousness returned. He blinked against the stark white light, his vision clearing to reveal the concerned face of a doctor standing over him. "Mr. Wright, welcome back," the doctor said, his tone professional but tinged with caution. "You collapsed during a meeting. We've run some tests." Christian tried to sit up, but his limbs felt heavy, his chest tight. "Tests?" he rasped. The doctor hesitated, glancing at the clipboard in his hands. "Your collapse was due to severe anemia, but that's just a symptom. Our tests indicate you have a rare genetic disorder, a progressive bone marrow condition. It's treatable, but the best chance for a cure is a bone marrow transplant, ideally from a direct relative." The doctor's words struck him with force. Christian stared at the doctor, his mind struggling to process. A relative? His parents had long since passed away, and he and Catherine had never had children. His vision blurred again, but this time it wasn't from dizziness. It was the realization of what he had done all those years ago. Diana, their son. There was someone. A boy. No, a man now. Christian sat alone in his penthouse that night, the city sprawling beneath him in a kaleidoscope of lights. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the storm churning within him. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on a glass of untouched whiskey on the desk. His mind drifted to the scrapyard, to the infant he'd left behind in that rain-soaked car. He could still hear the faint cries, see the glint of the silver necklace he'd wrapped around the baby's chest. He hadn't even given the boy a name. He pressed his hands to his face, the weight of his guilt pressing harder than ever. For years, he'd convinced himself that his actions were necessary, that he had been protecting the child from the harsh scrutiny of Catherine's family. However, now that his life was in jeopardy, the justifications seemed insincere. Reaching for his phone, Christian scrolled through his contacts until he found the name of a private investigator he'd used once before. "Mr. Wright," came the brisk voice on the other end. "I need you to find someone," Christian said, his voice low but firm. The investigator didn't ask questions, only assured him that he would begin the search immediately. The following days were a blur of waiting, each hour stretching unbearably long. Christian avoided his office, retreating instead to the solace of his penthouse. The walls seemed to close in on him as he replayed memories he had tried so hard to bury. Diana's weak smile as she handed him the necklace, the stormy night when he'd driven away from the scrapyard, the hollow feeling that had haunted him ever since. One night, unable to sleep, Christian opened the bottom drawer of his desk. It had been years since he last touched the necklace, but he swore he could still feel its weight in his hand. Except it wasn't there anymore. A wave of confusion and panic washed over him before he remembered. He had left it with the child. His fingers tightened around the edge of the drawer, his breath hitching. "My son," he whispered to the empty room, the name forming unbidden on his lips. He didn't know if that was the boy's name. He didn't know anything about the life he might have led. Was he alive? Had someone found him? Christian closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. He had built an empire, amassed wealth beyond imagination, but the one thing he couldn't control was the gnawing question of what had become of his son. The investigator's call came days later, piercing the silence of his isolation. "I've got a lead," the man said. "It's preliminary, but I'll follow up." Christian's heart lurched. For the first time in years, he felt something other than guilt. It was faint, but it was there. Hope. Hope that he might find the boy he had abandoned. Hope that it wasn't too late. The phone clicked as the call ended, leaving Christian alone in the suffocating quiet of his penthouse. For 18 years, he had buried the memory of his son beneath layers of work and excuses, convincing himself that his decision had been necessary. But now, with death lurking closer than ever, those excuses felt as thin as paper, unable to hold back the flood of regret. His reflection in the window stared back at him, a man graying at the temples, his face etched with lines that spoke of ambition, but also of loneliness. Outside, the city sparkled indifferently, its glow stark against the shadows pooling in his chest. "I'm a coward," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The abomination hung heavy in the room, pressing against his ribs. For years, he had let fear of Catherine's judgment and her family's wrath dictate his actions. Even now, the thought of confronting her sent a chill down his spine. But what terrified him more was the realization that he hadn't thought of Lucas out of love or responsibility, only desperation. "If he's alive," Christian's voice broke as he leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. "If he's alive, I'll make it right. I swear it." His promise wasn't to Catherine, her family, or his empire. He made a vow to the boy he had abandoned, a silent vow that carried a greater weight than his guilt. The streets pulsed with the frenetic energy of evening rush hour. Neon signs reflected off rain-slicked pavement, the hum of traffic and chatter filling the cool air. Christian Wright moved through the throng of people with deliberate steps, his tailored coat shielding him from the cold. He had left his car behind tonight, dismissing his driver with a wave. It was rare for him to walk home, rarer still for him to feel the pull to be alone. Yet the weight of the investigator's call hung heavy in his chest. A lead. For the first time in 18 years, the possibility of facing the boy he'd abandoned was more than an abstract guilt. It was a looming reality. He had barely crossed the intersection when the ache started. At first, it was a dull pressure in his chest, but with every step, it sharpened, radiating outwards. Christian stumbled, his breath catching. The sidewalk blurred, the voices around him growing faint. A hand pressed against a cold street lamp for support, but his legs buckled beneath him. The world tilted, and his vision darkened, revealing glimpses of concerned faces and a forming crowd. Lucas was halfway through his shift, delivering packages for a local courier service, when he spotted the commotion. On the sidewalk, a man in an expensive suit collapsed, his face pale and his breaths shallow. Lucas hesitated for a moment, his instincts wrestling with years of caution. People in this city often avoided strangers, particularly those who didn't appear to belong. But something about the man's labored breathing, the vulnerability etched into his features, spurred Lucas forward. "Hey!" Lucas knelt beside the man, shaking his shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" Christian's eyes fluttered open briefly, his gaze unfocused. Lucas noticed the sweat beading on his forehead, the tremor in his hands. "Hold on," Lucas said, his voice firm but calm. "I'll get you to a hospital." Within minutes, Lucas had flagged down a cab, his hands steady as he guided Christian into the back seat. "We love to know where our audience is from in the world. Tell us the name of the beautiful city you live in the comments section. Who knows, there might be some of your compatriots here." The driver hesitated at first, eyeing Lucas's worn hoodie and scuffed sneakers, but a sharp look from the young man silenced any objections. At the hospital, Lucas hovered as nurses rushed to wheel Christian into an emergency room. The sight of the man, frail and unsteady, stirred something unfamiliar in Lucas, a flicker of concern for a stranger he couldn't explain. Hours later, Lucas sat in the waiting area, his courier bag slung over one shoulder. He wasn't sure why he'd stayed. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, an unshakable instinct he couldn't name. The sound of sharp heels clicking against the linoleum broke through his thoughts. A striking woman in her late 40s, dressed in a tailored coat and carrying an air of authority, strode into the room. Her sharp gaze landed on Lucas immediately, narrowing with disdain. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her tone cold and clipped. Lucas frowned, taken aback. "I brought him in. He collapsed on the street." Her eyes swept over him, lingering on his threadbare clothes and untied sneakers. She pursed her lips, her disapproval palpable. "Well, you've done your part. You can leave now." Lucas stiffened at her tone, but didn't move. "I just wanted to make sure he's okay." Her laugh was sharp, almost bitter. "Don't think you'll get anything from this. Whatever scam you're running, it won't work here." "Scam?" Lucas's voice rose, incredulous. "I didn't—" The door to Christian's room creaked open, cutting him off. A nurse stepped aside as Christian's voice, weak but unmistakable, called out, "Stop!" Both Lucas and the woman turned, startled. Christian's eyes were open, his gaze fixed on Lucas. He struggled to sit up, his hand clutching the thin hospital blanket. It wasn't Lucas's face that had caught his attention. It was the glint of a silver chain, peeking out from beneath his shirt. For a moment, Christian forgot about the pain in his chest, the heaviness in his limbs. His focus narrowed on the necklace, its simple design etched into his memory. "Catherine," he rasped, his voice hoarse, "leave him." "But Christian, leave him." Catherine stepped back, her lips pressing into a thin line as she turned away. Christian's eyes met Lucas's, searching, questioning. "That necklace," he began, his voice trembling. "Where did you get it?" Lucas instinctively reached for the chain, his fingers brushing the pendant. "What does it matter?" he asked, wary of the strange intensity in the man's gaze. "It matters," Christian said, his voice breaking. His fingers clutched the blanket tighter, his chest heaving as the weight of 18 years crushed down on him. "Because it was my son's." Lucas froze, his hand dropping from the chain. "Your son?" The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths, and a past neither could fully grasp. The next morning, Christian requested a private room at the hospital to meet Lucas. Not only did his illness hurt, but what he was about to reveal made his chest hurt. Lucas arrived hesitantly, his steps slow and uncertain. He had intended to leave the hospital after the confrontation the night before, but something in Christian's voice had stopped him. Now, standing in the doorway, he watched the man he'd saved look up from his hospital bed. "Come in," Christian said, his voice soft but strained. Lucas crossed the threshold, his hands jammed into the pockets of his worn jacket. He didn't sit, hovering instead near the wall like he was ready to bolt. Christian gestured to the chair. "Please." Reluctantly, Lucas sat, his posture stiff. The silence between them stretched long enough to make the hum of hospital machines feel deafening. "You're probably wondering why I asked you to stay," Christian began, his hands clutching the edge of the blanket. His gaze dropped to Lucas's chest, where the necklace rested against his shirt. Lucas didn't respond, his brow furrowed in suspicion. Christian took a deep breath. "That necklace, it belonged to your mother, Diana." The name struck Lucas hard in the chest. His lips parted, but no words came out. Christian continued, his voice trembling. "Diana was someone I cared for, deeply. But I failed her. I failed you." Lucas's fists clenched in his lap. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, I'm your father." Christian's voice cracked on the last word. "I left you. I abandoned you when you were a baby." The room seemed to tilt as the words landed. Lucas stared at him, his eyes widening, his breath hitching. "You're lying," Lucas said finally, his voice low but fierce. "I wish I were," Christian replied, his gaze steady. 18 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life. I was weak, afraid of what others would think, afraid of losing everything. So I left you. When I returned, you had already left." Lucas stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the linoleum. "You're telling me that I've been nothing to you for 18 years, and now because you're sick, you want to find me?" His voice rose, raw with emotion. Christian flinched, but didn't look away. "I deserve your anger. I deserve your hatred. But it's not just about the illness. I've lived with regret every single day. I thought I could bury it, but I can't. I need to make this right if you'll let me." Lucas laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Make it right? How do you make up for abandoning a kid in a scrapyard? For leaving him to be someone else's problem?" Christian reached out, but Lucas stepped back, his movements jerky. "Lucas, don't." The name felt foreign on Lucas's tongue, too familiar and too strange all at once. "Don't call me that." His chest heaved, anger and confusion warring on his face. "You don't get to call me anything. You're just some rich guy who didn't want a kid ruining his life." Christian's hand fell limply to his side, his throat tight with unshed tears. "You're right. I don't deserve to call myself your father, but you deserve to know the truth, and if you hate me for it, so be it." Lucas stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The cemetery was quiet, the air crisp and tinged with the scent of damp earth. Lucas knelt before a modest gravestone, his hand brushing the carved letters of Megan's name. "I don't know what to do, Ma," he said, his voice cracking. "This man shows up, and he says he's my father. He claimed to have left me due to fear. What kind of excuse is that?" He pulled the silver necklace from beneath his shirt, holding it in his palm. "You never left," he whispered, his throat tightening. "You didn't have anything, but you gave me everything." The tears came then, hot and unchecked. He bowed his head, clutching the necklace like a lifeline. "I don't know if I can forgive him," he murmured, "but I miss you so much, Ma. I wish you were here to tell me what to do." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a strange, fleeting sense of peace. Lucas stayed there for a long time, the necklace warm against his skin, Megan's love steady in his heart, even in her absence. The Wright estate was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that preceded a storm. Christian sat in the drawing room, staring out at the sprawling garden. His hands rested on the arms of the leather chair, his fingers tightening unconsciously as he heard the click of approaching heels. Catherine entered, her posture rigid, her expression a mask of icy displeasure. She stopped just short of him, her arms crossed. "So, it's true," she said, her voice sharp. "The boy. You really think he's your son?" Christian turned slowly, his face pale but resolute. He is my son. Catherine. Her eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a bitter smile. And now you want to… what? Bring him into our lives? Should we treat him like a long-lost heir? Do you have any idea what this will do to our reputation? Christian sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. This isn't about reputation. Oh, don't be so naive, Catherine snapped, stepping closer. Everything we've built, your career, this family, it hinges on appearances. And now, after 18 years, you wish to devastate it all for a street kid who is likely only after your money. Christian flinched, resisting the temptation. He's not pursuing anything. He didn't even want to stay. He just wanted answers. And you gave them to him, didn't you? Catherine's voice was cold, laced with disdain. You handed him the ammunition to ruin everything. Did you even think about what this will mean for us? For once, Catherine, Christian said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I wasn't thinking about us. I was thinking about him. Catherine's eyes flashed with anger. You think this is noble. It's pathetic. You neglected him for 18 years, but now that you're approaching your death, you're suddenly inclined to assume the role of Father of the Year. Spare me. Christian stood, his tall frame towering over her, though his body swayed slightly from the effort. You're right, he said quietly, his voice heavy with guilt. I failed him. I failed Diana. Perhaps it's too late to make amends, but I refuse to let him go again. Not because of you, or your family, or anyone else. Catherine stared at him, her mouth tightening. You're delusional. He'll ruin you. He'll ruin us. Christian took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. Then allow it to crumble. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with tension. Finally, Catherine scoffed, shaking her head. You're throwing everything away for a boy who doesn't even want you. Christian's expression softened, but his resolve didn't waver. I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it for him. And if you can't understand that, then maybe it's not just me who's been failing this family. Catherine's eyes widened, her lips parted in shock. Without another word, she turned on her heel and left the room, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. Hours later, Christian sat in his study, the faint glow of the fireplace casting shadows across the walls. The confrontation with Catherine had drained him, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. The sound of a car pulling up in the driveway startled him. Moments later, a knock echoed through the quiet house. Christian rose slowly, his joints protesting as he made his way to the door. Lucas stood there, his face guarded, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. You said you wanted to make things right, Lucas said without preamble. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with barely restrained anger. Start by telling me why. Why did you leave me? Christian stepped aside, gesturing for Lucas to enter. The younger man hesitated before stepping into the grand foyer, his gaze flickering to the ornate details of the house. Follow me, Christian said quietly. They sat in the study, the warmth of the fire doing little to ease the tension between them. I was a coward, Christian began, his voice low but firm. Diana. She gave her life for you. And I… He paused, his throat tightening. I let my fear get the better of me. I was terrified of what would happen if Catherine's family found out. I thought I was protecting you by leaving you behind. Lucas's jaw tightened. Protecting me? Are you protecting me by dumping me in a scrapyard like I'm garbage? Christian flinched, the words cutting deeper than he'd expected. I thought I'd come back for you. When I returned, I found you gone. I looked for you. I know it wasn't intense enough, but I made an effort. And when I couldn't find you… He trailed off, his voice cracking. I told myself it was better that way, that someone else could give you what I couldn't. Lucas leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. And now, what changed? Christian met his gaze, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. Now, I'm dying. And I realized I've spent my entire life building an empire to fill the void I created. But nothing will fix what I did unless I try to make it right. Lucas's eyes flashed with anger, but beneath it was a flicker of something else. Pain. Maybe even longing. You don't get to just decide to fix things now, he said, his voice trembling. It's too late. Christian's shoulders slumped, but he didn't look away. Maybe it is. But if there's even the smallest chance, I have to try. The room fell silent, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Lucas stood abruptly, his movements sharp and restless. I need time, he said, his voice tight. Christian nodded, his heart heavy, as Lucas turned and left the room, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing through the house. The air in the park was still, the early morning fog clinging to the trees. Lucas sat on a weathered bench, the silver necklace dangling from his fingers. It caught the faint rays of the rising sun, glinting like a fragile thread between his past and the man who claimed to be his father. He turned the pendant over in his hand, tracing its smooth surface with his thumb. His chest tightened as memories of Megan surfaced. She taught him how to tie his shoes, her laughter soft and warm. She always found a way to stretch a pot of soup, even when there was barely anything left in the pantry. Her unwavering love was evident when she referred to him as her son. Kindness doesn't cost you anything, she used to say, her hands rough from work but gentle when she touched his cheek. But it can make someone feel rich. Megan had taught him to forgive, to be resilient even in the face of pain. Yet now, he felt torn. How could he forgive Christian for abandoning him? Could he forgive Christian for abandoning him in a scrapyard, treating him like a piece of discarded trash? Lucas closed his eyes, Megan's voice echoing in his mind. Everyone makes mistakes, mijo. What matters is whether they try to make it right. With a deep breath, he stood and tucked the necklace back under his shirt. The decision wasn't easy, but it was clear. He wasn't doing this for Christian. He was doing it for Megan. He was doing it for Megan, the woman who had taught him the importance of second chances, even when they felt undeserved. Christian was in his study when Lucas arrived. The knock on the door startled him, and he rose unsteadily, his illness sapping what strength he had left. When he opened the door, Lucas stood there, his face unreadable. "I'll do it," Lucas said simply, his voice steady but guarded. Christian blinked, his hand tightening on the doorframe. "What?" "The transplant," Lucas clarified. "I'll do it, but not because I owe you anything. I'm doing it because the woman who raised me believed in second chances." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Whether you like it or not, you're the only family I have left." Christian's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He nodded, his voice breaking as he said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Lucas said sharply. "This doesn't mean I forgive you. It just means I'm willing to give you a chance to prove you're not the man who left me." Christian's shoulders slumped slightly, but he nodded again. "That's more than I deserve." Lucas stepped past him into the room, his gaze briefly sweeping over the ornate furnishings. "So," he said, crossing his arms, "when's this happening?" The surgery took place 2 weeks later. The hospital room was sterile and quiet, the air thick with antiseptic and a faint undercurrent of tension. Lucas sat in a hospital gown, his fingers tapping against the armrest of the chair as a nurse explained the procedure. "You'll feel some discomfort," she said kindly, but Lucas barely registered her words. His eyes flicked to the adjoining room, where Christian was lying on a bed, pale and frail. As the nurse left, Christian turned his head toward Lucas. "I know I've said this already," he began, his voice weak, "but thank you. You didn't have to—" "I know," Lucas interrupted. His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried a firmness that left no room for further gratitude. The procedure was long and grueling, but it was a success. As Lucas sat in recovery, exhaustion weighing down his limbs, he felt a strange sense of relief. He felt this relief not for Christian but for himself. He had done the right thing. Megan had taught him that kindness did not equate to weakness. Later that evening, Christian woke up to find Lucas already dressed, his bag slung over one shoulder. "You leaving?" Christian asked, his voice still raspy. Lucas nodded. "I've done my part." Christian tried to sit up, but the effort left him breathless. "Lucas." Lucas paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. "This doesn't change anything," he said, without turning around. "But it's a start. Don't waste it." He left, leaving Christian alone in the quiet room, the weight of his second chance pressing heavily on his chest. The knock at Christian's office door was soft, hesitant. He looked up from his desk, his hands resting on a stack of untouched papers. His body, still recovering from surgery, felt weak, but his mind had been restless, filled with thoughts of Lucas. "Come in," he called. Lucas stepped in, his movements guarded but more relaxed than before. The tension of their earlier encounters had softened, though an air of wariness still lingered. "You wanted to see me?" Lucas asked, standing near the doorway. "Yes," Christian said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Sit, please." Lucas hesitated, but eventually took the seat, leaning back slightly, his arms crossed. For a moment, Christian studied him. The boy? No. The young man. He had abandoned all those years ago. Lucas was a stranger, yet in the set of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze, Christian could see Diana. "I wanted to thank you," Christian began, his voice quiet but steady. "Not just for the transplant, but for giving me a chance to know you. I know I haven't earned it, but I want to try." Lucas shrugged, his expression unreadable. "It's up to you what you do with it. I'm not making any promises." Christian nodded, his throat tightening. "That's fair." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. After a moment, Christian reached into a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. He slid it across the desk. Lucas leaned forward, his brows furrowing as he picked it up. The image was of a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, standing in a garden with flowers blooming behind her. "Diana," Christian said, his voice soft. "Your mother." Lucas stared at the photograph, his fingers brushing its edges. He didn't speak, but his expression shifted, a mix of curiosity and longing. "She was strong," Christian continued, "stronger than I ever was. She loved you more than anything, even though she barely got to hold you." His voice broke slightly, but he pressed on. "She made you want to be better, just spending time with her." Lucas set the photo down, his gaze lingering on it. "Megan," he said after a pause, "was like that too." Christian tilted his head, intrigued. "Tell me about her." Lucas hesitated, his fingers tapping against the desk. She worked hard. She worked harder than anyone I've ever known. We didn't have much, but she made sure I never felt like I was missing anything. She taught me how to fix things, how to take care of myself, how to care about people. His voice softened as he added, "She didn't have to take me in, but she did, and she gave me everything she could." Christian's chest tightened, guilt and gratitude swirling inside him. "She sounds like an incredible woman." "She was," Lucas said firmly. He leaned back in his chair, the photo still in his hand. "You don't get to know me without knowing her." She's the reason I'm here." Christian nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'd like to know more. About her. About you." Lucas shrugged, but his posture relaxed slightly. "I guess we'll see." Over the next few weeks, the two began to meet more regularly, their conversations tentative but growing in depth. Christian would share stories about Diana, her love for the garden, her stubborn determination, the way she always carried herself with quiet strength. In turn, Lucas spoke of Megan, how she taught him to mend things, how she always had a joke ready no matter how worn out she was, how she made him feel like he was enough even when the world made him feel small. She'd have liked Diana, Lucas said one day, surprising himself with the admission. Christian smiled faintly. "I think Diana would have liked her too." Their bond remained fragile, but each conversation built a small bridge between them, a tentative path towards something neither had thought possible. One afternoon, Christian invited Lucas to his office. The older man looked healthier, though his movements were still slow. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Christian said, sliding an envelope across the desk. Lucas opened it, pulling out a brochure for an elite university. He raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Christian folded his hands on the desk. "I want to help you get an education. I want to assist you in obtaining a high-quality education. You're smart, Lucas, and you've already done so much on your own. However, this could potentially unlock new opportunities for you." Lucas stared at the brochure, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he said finally. "College wasn't exactly in the cards for me." "It can be now," Christian said gently. "I know it doesn't make up for what I've done, but I want to give you this chance. No strings attached." Lucas looked up, his jaw tightening. "I'll think about it." Christian nodded, not pressing further. "That's all I ask." As Lucas left the office, the brochure tucked under his arm, Christian leaned back in his chair, a faint sense of hope flickering in his chest. Their bond was far from perfect, but for the first time, it felt real. The train station hummed with life, a mix of hurried voices and the rhythmic clatter of luggage wheels against the tile floor. Lucas stood near the platform, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a duffel bag at his feet. The brochure Christian had given him weeks ago now peeked from the side pocket of his bag, its corners slightly dog-eared from use. The decision to leave for Boston had been harder than he'd anticipated. Even now, as the train approached with a low rumble, his thoughts swirled with doubts, but beneath the uncertainty was a flicker of hope, one that grew steadily brighter the longer he stood there. Christian had insisted on coming to see him off, despite his lingering frailty. The older man approached now, his steps deliberate but measured. He looked different than he had weeks ago, healthier, more present. Lucas turned at the sound of his name. "You didn't have to come," he said, his tone neither warm nor cold. Christian offered a small smile. "I wanted to." He gestured to the bench nearby. "Do you have a few minutes?" Lucas hesitated, then nodded. They sat side by side, the duffel bag between them like a silent buffer. "I know I've said this before," Christian began, his voice quiet. "But I'm proud of you, Lucas. It's not just about giving this a chance, but also about being who you are. Your mother would have been equally proud of you. Both of them." Lucas shifted, unsure how to respond. He looked down at the silver necklace resting against his chest, its weight familiar and grounding. "Megan always said I should do something beneficial with my life. Something that matters, and you will," Christian said. His gaze softened, and he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out an envelope. "I wrote you something. It's not much, but I thought you should have it." Lucas took the envelope, his fingers brushing against its thick paper. He didn't open it, but he nodded, tucking it into his jacket. "Thanks." The train whistle sounded, signaling the final boarding call. Lucas stood, adjusting the strap of his bag. Christian rose too, his movements slow but steady. "I'll see you at Christmas?" Christian inquired, his voice filled with a tentative sense of hope. Lucas nodded. "Yeah, I think so." Their goodbye was simple, a firm handshake that lingered a moment longer than necessary, a nod of understanding passing between them. The train ride was quiet, the landscape blurring past in shades of green and grey. Lucas finally opened the envelope, unfolding the handwritten letter inside. "Lucas, I don't have the right words to explain how much I regret the choices I made, or how grateful I am that you've allowed me to know you. I can't change the past, but I hope to be part of your future in whatever way you'll let me. You are stronger, braver, and kinder than I ever was, and I am endlessly proud of the man you've become. Make this life yours, Lucas. Chase every opportunity, hold on to every hope, and know that you're never alone." With all my love and deepest apologies, Christian Lucas folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. He leaned against the window, the necklace cool against his skin. The train pulled into the station in Boston as dusk fell, the city's skyline glowing faintly in the distance. Lucas stepped onto the platform, the weight of the letter and the necklace a comforting reminder of the people who had shaped him. Megan, who had raised him with love and strength, and Christian, who was finally trying to be the father he should have been. As he walked toward the campus, the future stretched before him, vast and full of possibility. Lucas took a deep breath, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. With each step, the silver necklace gently bounced against his chest, serving as a quiet symbol of the connection, once broken, but now slowly mending. And as Lucas reached the university gates, he looked ahead, his face calm and resolute, his eyes filled with hope. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.